Hello and welcome to my 1000-mile review of the Honda CBR650R. The CBR is an inline 4-cylinder sports bike, fully faired, with approximately 94 brake horsepower and I think something like 24 Newton meters of torque. One of the primary features of this bike is the e-clutch system. The system automatically disengages or engages the clutch depending on what's happening without you having to use a clutch lever. But I'll go into more detail about that later. I originally test rode this bike in June. I was so impressed with it that I decided to buy one, and I traded my VFR 1200 FD in against it. I used the VFR for commuting, and I used the CBR for commuting. The VFR was quite a heavy bike, particularly heavy at the top of the bike, making it a little bit unwieldy when you're filtering through traffic. This bike is much lighter, much more nimble, and better for that sort of thing. Though there's a drop in power between the two, it's not actually as noticeable as you might think, because both bikes are pretty quick, even though their characteristics are somewhat different. I bought the bike on the 1st of July. It cost me £8,699, though looking at the cost of them on the web today, they've gone up to £8,729, which is a bit of an odd change, but there we go. I covered the first 600 miles before the 19th of July and had the first service, which cost £68. It's now the 9th of August. And I've now done 1,156 miles in it. I generally ride on a commute which involves about 35% motorway, 35% fast A roads, and then about 30% in the centre of town. I've ridden in all weathers, from the most horrendous rain on my first trip into town on it through to very bright sunny condition. So I've got a pretty good feel for what it's capable of. I found the running in period a little bit frustrating because you've got to be careful with the engine. You're very much in the mid-range of its rev band and there's not that much power there, so you kind of felt like you were really being held back. The last 500 or so miles I've been able to use the entire rev range, and the bike really comes alive when you get up to between 8 and 9,000 revs, and it revs all the way up to 12,000 revs. The engine's generally very smooth. It doesn't have a lot of torque or power at the bottom end of the rev range, which you'd kind of expect from a 4-cylinder engine, but certainly it's got an awful lot up at the top. One of the things that means with the e-clutch is that as you first pull away, if you're not using the clutch, you can't rev the bike and drop the clutch. You actually start quite low in the rev range, and it kind of starts off a little bit slow and then picks up and really gets going as soon as you hit the power band. If you want to go off quickly, you do have to manually use the clutch and rev the bike first, which makes a lot of sense. But I've seen some reviews where they've pitted the bike against other sports bikes and said, oh, it doesn't accelerate anywhere as quickly, and if you just use the e-clutch, no, it won't do. If you use the clutch manually, I think it will do. The sound of the engine is also pretty much the same sort of thing. Basically at lower revs you can't really hear it, it's not very exciting, but once you get up into that high rev band it really does make a lovely screaming noise, just what you'd expect of a 4-cylinder. As far as extras go, the bike was pretty much standard when I bought it. I did have heated grips put on it, and since I bought it I've put cameras, sat-nav on it and a tracker. I'll talk a little bit more later why I've gone for the sat-nav, because the bike does come with Honda Road Sync as standard. I also didn't go for a servicing contract because my dealer advised that I would likely spend more money on the servicing contract than I would on servicing with them, and to be quite honest, I've had a good relationship with them over a number of years and I trust their judgment on that. Let's talk about riding position and comfort. The riding position is a fairly neutral for a sporting bike. You are leaned forward, you are tucked up, but you do feel like you've got a fair bit of room. The seat itself is extremely comfortable. It's a lot more comfortable than some bikes I've owned. Certainly after about 2 hours in the saddle you're not getting a numb bum. The suspension, though it's not adjustable with the exception of preload at the rear, it is actually pretty comfortable, but also provides enough feel and enough firmness for pretty vigorous riding whilst not being unpredictable. The looks of the bike I'm very happy with. Looks are always a matter of taste and something that you just have to decide on yourself. However, I think this latest update does do a good job of making the bike look very nice and very pleasing to the eye. The dashboard itself is very clear. It's got a couple of nice settings, like you can switch it from dark to light. You can navigate through the menus on it very easily, and overall I think the dashboard is a pretty good thing. I'll talk about the Honda RoadSync later though. The lights do a good job of showing you the way ahead in the dark. I do rather like the fact the indicators are on permanently when you're riding as well. I think that creates a little bit of extra visibility. I certainly don't feel like, since I've changed from my previous bike, more people are suddenly pulling out of me or not noticing me. It's about the same, despite the fact it's a smaller and perhaps a slightly less obvious bike. As far as wind protection goes, when you're riding at speed, you get the wind in your face, obviously, because you've got no particular fairing, but your body, your upper body, and your legs, etc., are actually reasonably well protected by the fairings, and there's no undue buffeting. I've only got the standard screen on, I haven't put one of the aftermarket ones on or one of the Honda extra ones, and it's absolutely fine. Economy wise, I checked last time I did a trip into work, which was 116.5 miles round trip. The bike believed I'd done 65 miles to the gallon and 43 miles an hour as an average speed. When I filled the tank up and measured it against that, my calculation put it at 60 miles per gallon, which is still pretty good. The bike has a 15.4 litre tank, and so what that should mean is you're capable of getting 200 miles out of the tank. Realistically speaking, I had 2 bars left at 120 miles, so I'm not sure about that actual range, but it is still pretty economical. Tyre-wise, the bike comes fitted with Dunlop Road Sport 2s. I must admit I'm not exactly impressed with them. I've ridden in both very wet weather and very dry weather and everything in between. The grip levels on them in the dry is extremely good. If you're just going to use the bike for pooting around in the summer or for hacking around in the summer, they'll be really good and fine. If you're going to use it for wet weather or winter, I don't think you're going to like them particularly. I certainly found the front of the bike felt a lot looser, and the rear of the bike was much more inclined to kick its traction control in. I don't feel particularly safe in the wet on them by comparison to other bikes I've ridden with, something like Michelin Pilot Road 6s or something along those sort of lines, and I'll certainly be changing them as soon as I can. They're not so dangerous that I'd go, right, well, I want to change them now that I know that they haven't got that good performance in the wet. I just need to take a little bit more care, but they're certainly not, for the sort of use I use for the bike, a very good choice. However, as said, if you are just basically going to be using the bike in the summer or the dry weather, they're probably a really good choice of tyre. The brakes I found very effective. They certainly pull the bike up quickly. You get a fair bit of feel through them. The rear brake does have a tendency to lock up a little bit or flip on the ABS a little bit, but then that's probably me being a bit too keen with the bike. But overall, they're a good system. There's nothing to complain about there. So let's talk about things I don't like about the bike. Let's start off with the mirrors. My first problem with the mirrors is they have a tendency to move. At high speed, I had to tighten them when I got them. Not that you can tighten them that much, and they're a little bit better. The next thing about them is actually they provide a pretty bloody awful view. Now I understand it's a sports bike, so they're tucked in further, but they still do provide a pretty bloody awful view. Basically, to look behind you when I've got the mirrors set correctly, I have to pull my arm in and look round my arm. Now that may just be that I'm new to riding a sports bike, and that's very typical of all sports bikes. But certainly on my VFR, which I suppose is a sports tourer, that wasn't the case. You got a good visibility behind the whole time. So the next negative point I'm going to talk about is a Honda RoadSync. It's a bit harsh for me to say it's negative, but for me it just doesn't work. For the first point is the Honda RoadSync has the sat-nav that you can use on your phone and it will show up, but it shows up turn-by-turn signals. There were complaints on forums about it not giving you the right indication at roundabouts. When I tried it, it did do that. It was absolutely fine on that. If you're happy with a basic sat-nav system, it's no problem at all. Personally, I like to be able to see a map and know roughly where I'm going and see whether I want to take an opposite route or something along those sort of lines, and so it didn't really work for me in that respect. The other thing I like to do when I'm riding is I listen to music. I do a fair bit of motorway work and it's particularly nice to have it there. But I have an iPhone, and when I'm listening on the iPhone, it has a point where it stops and says you can't have the volume over this without pressing an extra button and going a bit higher, basically. With my helmet on and my earplugs in, I have to have it at absolute maximum volume. However, when you connect it through the Honda RoadSync, it will not let you go past that safety volume. And as a result, when you're going down the motorway at 70 miles an hour, you literally just cannot hear the music. So It's all very well being able to move a track forward and see what it is you're listening to, but that's no good if you can't hear it at all. So for me, the Honda Road Sync just does not work. If they get rid of the point at which it stops you from turning the volume up, then I'd be quite happy to use it, certainly at least for that part of the features, if not for the sat-nav. And it's a pity because it's a good system to put into a bike and it just doesn't quite work. It should do, it just needs a little bit more development. That said, if you read the reviews of the application, they do talk about the fact that they've had multiple problems, and the developers do seem to be listening to the problems and working on them. So hopefully when I do the 10,000 mile review, you'll actually hear a different story about that, because I will carry on retrying it. My other issue is about how you take it apart. In order to fit the sat-nav camera and the tracker, I had to take quite a lot of the fairings off. It wasn't particularly difficult, but there weren't any instructions on how to do it on 24 out, and particularly around here the fairing is actually attached by two pieces that slot together, and they're very, very stiffly attached, and so I broke one when taking it apart. I put up a video to say how to do it and make sure people understood you had to slide this forward, and even then I've had at least one comment back turning around saying, following your video, I still managed to break it because it's so tight in there, and it just seems unnecessary. You could easily have put a bolt behind or something along those sort of lines to fix that in a way that would protect it from being damaged moving forward. Lastly, let's talk about the e-clutch system. Is it good? Is it bad? Personally, I really like it. I'm going to slightly temper my view to what I said when I first did the first review. It's not necessarily always the smoothest thing in the world. So for example, if you are accelerating up very, very hard, it's extremely smooth. If you are changing down and you're gently going down the gears as you slow down, it's nice and smooth. The flip side also is the case. If you're accelerating gently, sometimes when you're changing up gear, it can be a bit rough. And when you're decelerating, if you are trying to change gear hard as you decelerate down towards a corner or something like that, it can be a bit jerky, and that's because it doesn't have a ride-by-wire system, and as a result it can't blip the throttle and get the revs quite right, and you can't manually do it either as you're changing gear. So all in, for the £100, it's an incredibly good system, particularly if you're doing a lot of town work. So for me, driving through the centre of town, being able to just sort of sit at the lights and not bother about using the clutch, it may sound a bit wussy, but it's a really useful feature. So I don't regret it at all. I would slightly temper my judgment on it over what I'd said in the original videos, but I still think it's an excellent system. So to round up, would I recommend the bike? Well, it's very comfortable, very easy to live with. The e-clutch definitely makes a lot of sense if you're doing a lot of town work. I don't think it would necessarily make an awful lot of sense if you were out of town particularly the whole time. But it's definitely a very comfortable, very easy to use, very nice bike with a good range and good fuel economy, and so far quite good running costs. If you're going to ride it in the wet, change the tyres, or don't expect much of the current tyres, but apart from that, really nice, can't complain. But then I suppose I'm biased because I bought the bike. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.
Who jammer flip?
Who jammer flip?